Thank you so much, Venerable Ajahn Brahm, for this opportunity to once again ask some questions on the Dharma. And I am sure that this will be a very interesting and inspiring conversation for all of us who are involved in it, but also for the many people who will be listening to it later on. First of all, I'd like to ask a personal question. I know that you graduated from Cambridge University, where you studied theoretical physics and had quite an illustrious career ahead of you. And I just wonder, why did you give up that career to study and practice Buddhism?
One of the reasons was that when I became interested in Buddhism and started meditating, of course, in meditation, I had one of the most fantastic experiences, much more profound and even pleasurable than anything I'd ever experienced in the world. And I wanted to explore that further. And the wonderful thing about Buddhism in Thailand at that time is you never needed to become a monk forever. And I told all my family and friends that I'll be back in a couple of years. I'll take the opportunity to go to Thailand, become enlightened, and then come back and get married and carry on my career. That's how little I knew about what enlightenment was. But nevertheless, it was an opportunity to pursue my spiritual life. And as you know, and a great teacher like an Ajahn Chah, that really just blossomed so much. And personally, I think I've told you this before, that even the first days when I was in brown robes in Bangkok, that I would wake up in the middle of the night with a nightmare, about 3 or 4 nights in a row. The nightmare was always the same. My nightmare was that I was a layperson, not a monk, honest. And I'd open my eyes and see my robes folded next to the bed or the mat on the floor which I was sleeping. And I thought, wow, I'm a monk. And I closed my eyes and had a beautiful sleep afterwards. And that's actually how much, deep inside, I really, really, really wanted to become a monk. And you know me for many years, but never once in all those years I've been a monk did I ever want to do anything else.
What in particular drew you to seek out Venerable Ajahn Chah rather than the many other teachers who were teaching at the time in Thailand?
Well, of course, I didn't. I was in Bangkok and I saw, I think, the first 2 Western monks I'd ever seen. And they, from Ajahn Chah's monastery, they invited me up just for a visit. So I went up there for a visit. And then Ajahn Chah was talking to one of the other monks, Western monk, and with the translator. And I was just overhearing, seeing what Ajahn Chah was saying. And then Ajahn Chah never asked a question of this young novice monk. He was asking the questions I was thinking. And it was a weird experience, but then I deliberately thought another question. And then Ajahn Chah would answer my question I was thinking. And then another question, another question, another question. And he'd always be answering my questions, very good answers. At the end of that sort of experience, I asked the novice monk who was asking the question, what do you think about Ajahn Chah's answers? They're ridiculous. They made no sense at all. He wasn't answering me at all. And that was, see, that this monk has got obviously something special. So that made I stayed there much longer.
Well, that obviously made a strong impression, as I would expect and would to anyone who had that experience. Yes. And you did live in Thailand for about 9 years, I think. Were there any other memorable, what you would consider really important experiences during your time there?
Well, there's one of the experiences which, of course, I will never forget with him was that after about 8 years, 9 years, when I was fluent in Thai at that time and the Northeast dialect, and that Ajahn Chah would come over to that monastery, Wat Barnanachad, which you know very well. And he would once a week for a sauna. But before he'd have his sauna, he would have give a talk to us all. And I think you also know that sometimes Ajahn Chah's talks were very boring, but sometimes he was just on fire, and it was a wonderful talk. And this was one occasion which his talk was so inspiring that after hearing that talk, instead of helping the duties of a disciple to the teacher and helping with his sauna, there were so many other monks who could do that. So I went to the back of the hall and just crossed my legs, just on the concrete, and just sat meditation for 2 hours. A very, very, very beautiful meditation. I was using the inspiration, the happiness, the joy of a great talk. And when I came out of meditation, the first thing I thought of was to see if I can still help my teacher. So I got up, walked over to the sauna, and Ajahn Chah had already finished. He was coming the opposite direction with his driver, Thai. And when I came close to Ajahn Chah, we had to pass on the path. And that's when, I don't mind saying this now because Ajahn Chah's passed away, that he looked at me, and it's a weird experience. You could feel him inside your mind. It's the best way I can talk about it. He was reading my mind. And for once, I was quite happy that he could come inside. Everything was tidy and clean and beautiful. And so he came inside, and good for him inside. And then that's the best way I can describe it. But then he sort of went back into his own mind. And then he looked at me and he said, Brahma Wangsa, that's the full name, Brahma Wangsa. Why? Very simple question, why? And I was still quite dumb as a monk, and I said, I don't know. And he just laughed his head off. And then, you remember that, he would never criticize, he would just laugh, think it's so funny that these Westerners with such great education were so stupid. But then he looked at me again and told me the answer. He said, if anyone asks you that in the future, this is the answer to the question, why? It was just myself, Ajahn Chah, and the Thai driver. That's all was there at the time. And he said, the answer to the question, why, is there's nothing. There's nothing. You can still remember your Thai. My me arai. My me arai. And he looked at me with a lot of kindness and compassion. He said, do you understand? And I said, yes, I understand, sir. And he looked at me and said, no, you don't. And he walked away. That was inspiration, but then also such a put down afterwards. So I felt really miserable, but inspired at the same time. That was a beautiful little interview, very quick. And the answer to the question, why? It's nothing. It's nothing. Because of how it happened or where it came from, that's a little thing which I will never forget.
Did the true significance of that question and the answer come to you it seems that it didn't arise at that particular time because you said no.
I don't understand. Of course you understand later on, because the things which someone like that say, they're so profound and so powerful, and where they come from, the situation where they were asked or said, was so powerful. Of course you use that many, many times. And it was just very powerful. There's nothing, emptiness, nothing left when a person gets so fully enlightened and passes away. There's nothing survives. The process is finished. It's not that something is destroyed or something exists in some refined states. There's nothing. Nothing to arise, nothing to pass away. So that was a wonderful sort of deep teaching. And you knew that Ajahn Chah really just had a beautiful, clear mind. And went inside to check first of all and gave me that wonderful teaching.
Would you share any other memorable experience other than with Ajahn Chah during those years that you lived in Thailand?
Of course, some of those teachings which you had were fabulous. But one which comes to mind right now, those times when, as a monk, we could actually leave the monastery, and they used to call it go on tudong, which meant just carrying all your possessions on your back and with no real destination, just walking along the roads of Thailand to the mountains, to the great teachers. And of course, after a little while, the things which you thought were essential to carry on your back soon started to lessen and lessen and lessen. And soon you were just carrying your bowl, the mosquito net, umbrella, and the mosquito net as well. And very, very few things. And it was light. And you could go on any direction. I always remember that, just the freedom of having so few possessions. The way I describe it, and I remember it so clearly, you just get to any crossroads, and you could go ahead, you could go left, you can go right, you can turn around and go back again. You had this total freedom. You weren't going anywhere because you didn't have anywhere to go to. And anywhere in that part of the world, you could find an easy place just to put your mosquito net umbrella, just to sit down, meditate, go to sleep at night, and get up in the morning, go to the nearest village, and always get something to eat. So it's incredible freedom of not being bound to any monastery, to any people, or to any place. And that sort of freedom I still can recall. It was like being a bird, just flying with the weight of your own 2 wings. And I often mention that because sometimes you see the birds migrating. I never seen any bird needing to have a COVID vaccination pass when it goes from country to country. Never seen them with suitcases or backpacks. They just fly. And that freedom is just a wonderful thing, which I always recall from that time.
I know that some Western monks who ordained about the same time as you and lived in the same monasteries did experience tremendous difficulties, and whether it was due to just mental difficulty, struggling with their meditation, or with physical sickness. Do you think that you had an easier time than some of these other monks because your mind seemed to be very, very well inclined towards good meditation?
Yes, I think I did have a much easier time. I've got to admit that. And mostly I think it was because I learned meditation, was pretty good at it, even when I was at university. Before I came to Thailand, I'd already meditated about 5 years and had some pretty good meditations. Mm-hmm. And those meditations, knowing exactly what to do and having trained that way and being inclined to a simple lifestyle really helped. Yeah, I had my girlfriends before I became a monk. But even there, I remember just when the one girlfriend I spent about 6 months with, that when we decided to split up, I was actually quite surprised. There's no real sadness or craziness in my mind. We had a wonderful time. Well, thank you. Let's go on. And there wasn't any trauma there at all. And the same with my father, died, as I've said many times, when I was only 16. It's very similar. I never cried at his funeral service. Never cried since. And I've told us similarly before, it's like going to a great concert. When the concert's finished, you don't cry. You don't feel sad after a wonderful performance. You think how lucky I was to have been there at the time and a great performance. And that's some of the things which I'm not sure where they came from in my life, but they were there. So when things finished, you didn't feel sorry for yourself or sorry for others. It's wonderful to have that great time together.
Of course, you are in the Theravada tradition, as most of the monks in Thailand and Southeast Asia are. And I know that the Theravada Buddhists often claim that the Pali scriptures represent the most authentic record of the Buddhist teachings. in contrast to many of the other scriptural traditions. How do you think, what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, do those monks really know what they're talking about? Because as you know, that for years and years and years, they were never really studied the Pali tradition. I know what part of that Pali tradition is authentic. And maybe it's because we're Westerners. We're not trying to reform. We haven't got an agenda to bring Buddhism into the modern age. No, we're just being reasonable. And the reason is that if you read a book, you can tell if the book is written by Sir Charles Dickens or William Chaucer or Shakespeare or the author of Harry Potter. The language changes. So you can actually see that even in the Tripitaka, there are some passages and some parts of Tripitaka which are written much later than the earlier part, hundreds of years later. So because of that, you can use basic reason, logic, and to see what was original teachings of the Buddha. I'm not talking about Theravada now, because I know, and one of the nice things about being a senior monk, as you can remember, is that people feel afraid of arguing with you. If I'd have said this when I was a young monk, they would have called me just totally conceited. But things like the Abhidhamma tradition, and it's certainly not spoken by the Buddha, came many years later. Even though that some people would try and jump on me and said, that is almost heretical, but it's true. You can defend that very easily. So that's why that when you're reading the Pali Suttas, you find out, number one, make sure you've got a really good translation. And number two is make sure you know what suttas are authentic and what are added later on. And a good example of that is, because of the meditation which I've been doing and teaching and practicing for years and years and years, you have something like the word for meditation. Even today, in the United States and many other countries, they call it concentration or insight meditation. And that's drives me crazy to hear things like that, because samadhi does not mean concentration. It means stillness. And where did that come from? It's just that's what you were practicing. That's what Ajahn Chah, what I heard him say many times. It's a stillness. In Thai, Jit Ning Yu. Ning means being still, not moving. And stillness does not come across by holding something tight. That exhausts you. But stillness comes from just letting go, putting things down, detaching. And so that is the type of meditation I've been teaching for years and practicing for years. So when you read the suttas, you have to make sure you've got very accurate translations. And the translation has to come from someone who's actually practicing what they're doing. Otherwise, they may say these things, but they don't really understand what they're talking about. They haven't experienced the stillness and its power.
With regards the some of these, say, core teachings, then we find that the Buddha, I think, when referring to a human being, he would often use mind-body compound.
Yeah.
So, how do you define mind?
Okay. So, first of all, I like simple anecdotes, simple teachings. And this was one of my university friends who wrote a letter to me in the early years. This is way before the time of emails. And his young daughter, who was in grade 1 at school, was asked a question by the teacher. The whole class was asked the same question. What is the biggest thing in the world? And one little kid put their hand up and said, my daddy's the biggest thing in the world. This is only a 5 or 6-year-old kid. Someone else said, no, an elephant is much bigger than your daddy. No, a mountain is much bigger than an elephant. And the daughter of my friend put her hand up and said, my eye is the biggest thing in the world. And everyone stopped. Even the teacher did not understand what this 5 or 6-year-old kid was talking about. What do you mean your eye is the biggest thing in the world? Well, said this 5 or 6-year-old genius, my eye can see her daddy and an elephant and a mountain and so much more. If all of that can fit into my eye must be the biggest thing in the world. And that was just a good example of taking a question and seeing it from a different perspective and getting a much better answer. And then, of course, when he told me about that, I wrote back and said, 9 out of 10. But there's something much bigger than the eye, that is your mind. The mind can see everything your eye can see, and it can imagine things which you will never see in real life. It can hear real imaginary sounds, smells, tastes, physical feelings in the body, real and imaginary, and it also can have its own field of knowledge. In fact, everything which you will ever know, or you can ever know, real or imaginary, can fit into this mind. So the mind is the biggest thing. And I never said in the world. You can know the world, the universe, all philosophies, all teachings can be known. Therefore, they can fit into the mind. The mind is the biggest thing. To me, that was a beautiful way of seeing just the vastness of this mind. So that's one way, but to make it even more interesting, how do you know there is a garden or a park? You know it by what's in that garden or park. The trees, the paths, the grass, the bushes, the flowers, the lakes. That almost defines the thing which we mean, like a park or a garden. So the same way a mind, you can know it by what it contains. It contains the emotions, the positive ones and the negative emotions. It contains things like thought. It contains things like will. It contains things like consciousness. There's many more than just one. All of that is in this thing we call the mind. It's not in the body, it's in this thing called the mind. And that's what defines this entity which we call mind.
So consciousness is a part of the mind, but we would use that word as distinct from mind. And is there a Pali reference to make that distinction?
Yeah, of course. That's why I did say this, but you probably didn't notice it because it wasn't emphasized. I never talk about consciousness, but consciousness is. So 6 totally different types of consciousness associated with every sense which we have. So eye consciousness is totally different than sound consciousness, which is totally different from every other consciousness, which is totally different than mind consciousness. Like knowing is the usual word we say for this, a mind consciousness. And that is the biggest, because it can contain all the other consciousnesses in one sense. And so that is the thing which, again, people always want to try and find what it actually is. We have many theories about what this mind consciousness is, this knowing. And of course, for many people, they never understand what it really is. They have many theories. And one of the similes, which you've heard me say before, was the simile of the tadpole and the frog. A tadpole can never know what water truly is, because it lives in water, born in water, spends all its life in water. It doesn't know the nature of water no more than a fish can. Even if it studies water, still, it's just theory. But then the difference between a fish and a tadpole is that one day the tadpole grows legs and arms, becomes a frog. And then one day the frog jumps and is outside of the lake, sitting on the banks of the lake, on dry land. It realizes that something which has always been there, water, is now gone, finished, disappeared. In the same way that when a person goes into a deep meditation, you see so much of consciousness is not there anymore. And other types of consciousness are there, or more refined mind consciousness. And the whole path of meditation of being still is allowing things to disappear. And as they disappear, you realize they're not essential. They're not permanent. They're not something which is always going to be there. And that's where we start to understand the mind consciousness being, well, they say in the Pali term, anicca. And anicca does not just mean coming and going. It means subject to going totally forever.
Obviously, mind consciousness, we see that as a type of consciousness. But this mind consciousness, is the mind one thing and consciousness a part of the mind? Is there any distinction between mind and consciousness?
No.
Very good. That's simple enough.
This is actually just looking at the suttas. One of the earliest of the suttas, and it's the first one in the first book, which was supposed to be recited in the first council, the Brahmajala Sutta, where they have 62 wrong views. Wrong view number 8 is that whatever is called vijnana, which is consciousness, or mano, which is mind, or citta, and learning Pali, you see the word the Buddha uses, you call it this or that one thing which is called the same by human beings, because they don't really know what they're talking about. So people who think that's going to last forever, that's the wrong view. And so the way even the Buddha used these words is not as a lawyer or as a philosopher, as a human being. And you all have the idea of mind or consciousness or awareness or knowing or whatever. And the Buddha says, it doesn't matter what you call it. That, call it mind, you can call it consciousness, knowing. That is going to disappear forever.
We'll come back to that. Let me just ask you, how does this consciousness arise or evolve? I mean, where does it come from?
Now we're going into the idea of time. And it's like saying, where does this universe come from? And of course, that was why I got involved in theoretical physics, to find answers for such questions. And of course, the theory which was dominant even today is Big Bang. And that was, again, from Professor Hawkins. And even now, or even actually before Professor Hawkins died, I know one of his collaborators, Bernard Carr. He was one of my best friends over in Cambridge. And he was emeritus professor of theoretical physics in Queen Mary College at the moment. But he was one of the close disciples of Stephen Hawkins. I confirm what I saw in the documentary about Stephen Hawking's life, that even Professor Hawkins envisioned a universe without boundaries. That doesn't mean just physical boundaries. It means boundaries of time as well, because time and space are intricately connected. We have this idea of beginnings and endings. Why? Because I'm sure that you many times have thought of space, and if you go far enough, is there an edge to space? But everyone knows it's got a limited volume, this thing we call our universe. It's expanding, the volume of space. Expanding into what? That question doesn't make any sense at all. Has it got an edges to it? It says, no, it's curved. So it's just like a balloon. It's got, a certain area, surface area of a balloon is just being blown up. There's no edges on it. There's no centers, there's no beginnings, there's no ends to that balloon. It's round. You go as far as you want in one way, and you come back eventually to where you started. And it's expanding all the time. And that with space, people can have a better idea of the curvature of space. But if space is curved, of course, time can be curved as well. So imagine a curved time, a time which is no beginning, no end. Where do things come from? That question will never have a good answer. It's created by somebody, but where did they come from? Yeah, we're created by something else. Where did they come from? And it just kicks the can down the road without any real solution. But as an idea of curved time, no beginning, no end. And that's a far more accurate description of things like time. So we don't talk about beginnings.
Very good.
Thank you for that.
I read something that Dr. Dean Radden recently wrote.
Yeah.
Yes, he said that he speaks about a perennial wisdom that says consciousness is fundamental and that consciousness comes before space and time.
Again, that prove it. And I think if Dr. Radin, he's doing some great research on how consciousness actually affects matter. I think that was one of the reasons I knew his name, that how you can. I think his research was including random number generators and getting lots and lots of people to focus and to make sure that the generation of random numbers was not random. And it had a sort of had an effect of people who could meditate and change the randomness. A very easily demonstrable sort of science experiment. But of course, many people would disprove that until they saw the evidence. And if Professor Radin could get into a deep state of meditation, could be a little tadpole that jumps outside of the lake, would realize that this thing, which is consciousness, always think it's there. Now parts of it, a lot of it, start to vanish. And you realize it's not fundamental at all. This is based on experience, not on just theories. As you know, a lot of times the experiencing these things, they throw you. They turn you upside down. The way you perceive the world is not the way the world really is. And to be able to do that, to get a new perception of reality, that takes a lot of stillness. It's like after you've been in a deep meditation for a while, you have fearlessness. Fearlessness to be able to see things in a quite threatening way, threatening your sense of self and permanence.
I have a couple more questions that I think by now may be not so pertinent because you've probably already addressed them, but just to elaborate a little more, I mean, what do you think about a term like universal consciousness that people sometimes refer to?
It's just like every other type of consciousness, that it is not going to last. This universe doesn't last. Why should universal consciousness last? And it's a comforting idea. You ask people to point to it. Where is it? What does it do? There's one thing which I got from reading Buddhist texts. If there's consciousness, you have to be conscious of something. Otherwise, the word doesn't make any sense at all. And so if you're conscious of something, what is universal consciousness conscious of? And it also, whatever you're conscious of, has to change. Because if you're conscious of one thing and that one thing lasts for a long, 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 long time, then consciousness turns off. One of those experiences I had meditating in the Zen monastery as a student. I just go anywhere I could to do a retreat. I didn't know what we were supposed to do, but I was sitting down, eyes open, just watching a whitewashed wall. That was the only meditation instruction you had. So I was watching this whitewashed wall, eyes open, and after about 45 minutes, because I knew how to be in this present moment and not to think or not to judge, just to be quiet inside, then the wall vanished. It just wasn't there anymore. You know, there's an earthen wall, and now it was gone. And that was really cool. I wasn't frightened because those are the days in the 60s where these were really cool experiences. There's no drugs or anything involved. You know, I was on my precepts, but then I thought, what is happening here? And of course, you realize the nature of all the consciousnesses, the six consciousnesses, is only to notice things which change. If a person closes their eyes, they can see the inside of their eyelids for a few seconds, and then the sense of sight turns off. If you're listening and there's a sound of an aircon or a fan or a heater in the background, after a while you can't hear it. The taste in your mouth, unless you're actually tasting sort of some food, after a while you can't taste it anymore because nothing is changing. The nature of consciousness is only to be able to perceive things which change. Otherwise, it disappears.
So it is quite clear that all forms of consciousness, all consciousness is impermanent. Would that be correct statement? That's
correct. That's almost precisely what the Buddha said in his second sermon, Anatta Lakkhana Sutta. And when I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, there's no way out of this conclusion. How the Buddha taught, whatever consciousness there is, refined, ordinary, I would add a few things like cosmic, eternal, original, all types of consciousness, said the Buddha, all Vijnana, is impermanent, anicca, and it's also suffering. And that's an interesting one. It's also suffering. In other words, that when you shut down a few of these consciousnesses, especially the first five senses, you're blissing out in these deep meditations. Where's that bliss coming from? It's coming from the absence of the five senses. And in the second jhana, the absence of will. You're still, you can't do anything. So this is where the mind blisses out to another level. And what that's teaching is pretty obvious, that will, choice, is dukkha, is suffering. But that's really controversial because, even the US Constitution, free will, the ability to pursue my own form of happiness. We take the will to be our right and we guard it to almost violently sometimes. But then when somebody comes along and says, no, your will is suffering, it's dukkha. It's your enemy, not a friend. Then that is quite challenging.
Of course, I would have to conclude from that you would also say that any form of knowing is also impermanent.
And suffering.
And suffering.
Yes, exactly.
Is it possible for there to be consciousness with no object of consciousness? I think you've already said no, but I just want to make sure that that's what you say.
Exactly, yes.
Okay. I do have a note from I did ask a friend if they would have any question that they would ask you. And a friend said this about his experience. When meditating, a state where there are no thoughts, no recognition of the state, no sense of I am meditating or I am in silence, and yet there isn't unconsciousness. There is an effortless, spontaneous, non-self-referential presence. This state doesn't seem to fall into any of the 5 aggregates or 6 consciousnesses. Where do you put this?
Put that into 6th consciousness, mind, because he knows it. So if it can be experienced, another way of saying it's known. At the time, if it is a jhana state, sometimes you cannot analyze it within that state. But you can remember it afterwards very clearly. And when you come out afterwards, it's what the Pali says, paccavekkhana. And when you come out afterwards, that is when you can look back at that experience, which is very easy to remember because it's a powerful experience. It's like a trauma, but totally positive. And so you analyze it afterwards, and then you find out exactly what's happening. In those states, you're so still, you can't actually move things around to understand them. Sometimes I can put something in front of the camera. And if you hold it if I didn't move this, it's like a pen, and just end on, sometimes you wouldn't be able to understand what it was. To understand, you move it this way, you move it that way, you can get different perspectives, add all those perspectives together, and you can understand what it is. You can't move things within those deep meditations. So yeah, it's no sense of I am. Excellent. Because that's usually no sense of will. It's what it probably referred to. And there's no movement of the mind. You're aware. You can't really analyze it within that state. If you try and analyze it, then the state falls apart. But afterwards, you can analyze it. And you realize you were knowing. The other 5 senses were probably gone, but the mind knew that state. So, you're still mind consciousness.
Very good. Now, you've spoken at length about developing jhana, and you've already mentioned this evening, something of that experience. And you do note that the arising of a nimitta during your meditation, as meditation progresses and becomes increasingly peaceful, and you deepen in stillness and silence, do you think that the arising of a nimitta is a prerequisite for being able to access jhana?
It is the best way to practice to get jhanas, because the nimittas, you know where you are, and it gives rise to more sense of joy and happiness. But you can bypass nimittas. As soon as I say that, I say it with the writer, but don't just try to bypass the nimittas. Try and get those nimittas, because the other side, the mind is very still, peaceful, it's building up energy, and it's the best way to know you are getting into those jhanas. And I know that sometimes people comment and said, but Ajahn Brahm, the Buddha never talked about nimittas. And the answer is, of course he did. It's in the Upakalesa Sutta. I think that's number 108 or 128. I always get those two mixed up. Of the Majjhima Nikaya. The only thing was that the translation, which Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi did, he translated it as that thing, instead of translating in Pali nimitta. But if you look at the original Pali, you see there's all the different problems we have with nimittas before you enter the jhanas. And so there's a whole sutta about that in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Upakalesa Sutta. But sometimes you can go quite quickly past those nimittas. The mind gets very still or peaceful, or you may experience some of them but not really recognize what they are. But it's a build-up of energy, joy, stillness, and it gives rise to these beautiful states of nimittas.
Interesting that you bring up that particular sutta. the Upakiresa Sutta, and that is often how I remember teachers, some Thai monks, speaking about nimittas as that they would be a hindrance or an obstacle. And often people, not often, but there are people, meditators, who approaching and deep meditation and experience a variety of nimittas and strange, unusual experiences, such as seeing beings in different realms and getting caught up in maybe clairvoyant type of experiences. And so it was mentioned as more as a danger rather than as a something, a stepping stone. What do you advise about that?
They are stepping stones. You can slip on any stepping stone and fall into the water, which is why the Buddha would actually give that teaching on how to deal with these nimittas, how to sort of strengthen them. It's a sign of stillness of the mind. The energy is building up. And these nimittas, it's just the way your mind perceives a realm of the mind. So any of the things you see, they're not real. It's just what the mind adds on. Not real as I say, real beings, real spirits. This is just what the mind adds on, how it interprets these pure mind experiences. And so when you know what you're doing, you're not trying to get psychic powers or anything. You're trying to keep your mind even more still. And by focusing on the most beautiful, peaceful, inspiring parts of that image, then you get the very simple, powerful nimittas, single lights, the beautiful lights. And one of the characteristics of real nimittas is whatever light you see, say it's a white light, it's more white than any light you can ever see in the real world. And the yellow light is intensely yellow, something which you can't paint. More blue than blue is a common expression. And so these are actually the lights, which are mind objects. The mind is seeing them, and the mind is getting delighted by them. So you stay there. Little by little, they turn into the nimittas. So turn into the jhanas.
Excellent. Well, can you just give a brief description of the distinction between the jhanas, just because they are obviously extraordinarily remote for most ordinary people? As you say, the fish is hard to imagine, but still, to get some idea of, because the Buddha did speak about the four jhanas, and so are they actually four distinct jhanas, and that they have distinct, clear characteristics?
Yes, of course. So, but then, in the sense that the second jhana is a special case of the first one, it still has some qualities of the first jhana, but not what I call like the wobble of the mind just going onto the object and just moving away a little bit of the first jhana. It's just as the confidence builds up, they call it sampasadhana. As that builds up, as you allow yourself to let go even more. It's a natural process. You don't make a decision. But you get confident and at ease in that state. So you don't need to react at all to the bliss. And you're just letting go more, and that means it settles down. So the first jhana is the five senses are totally gone, a long way away from them. And then you have the bliss, which is based on being separated from the five senses. And then second jhana is where you're not moving at all, absolute stillness. And then that stillness is again gorgeous. They're totally aware. And then in all of those first four jhanas, you're not experiencing a light anymore, like a nimitta or a shape. That's not how you're interpreting it at all. It's different types of ecstasy. Really stable mindfulness, incredibly strong mindfulness. There's not moving. Very still and peaceful. You stay there long enough, of course, things start to vanish. And the only thing left to vanish, the will has vanished already. So you can't choose to do anything. What vanishes now is your consciousness, your mind consciousness. Starts to vanish little by little. And that's the experience of the arupas. The next 4 stages. Your mind stops. It's not your mind anyway. But little by little, things cease. Totally, everything. Then you can actually start to see the nature of this mind consciousness. This is experience. At the time, you can't understand what's going on because you're too still. But it is a powerful imprint in your mind. And afterwards, what the heck was that? You analyze it, see it afterwards with courage. So that's how that one works.
So this that you explained, this gradual progression through the jhanas and then beyond the 4 jhanas, are you referring to the experience of this, what they term as the cessation of feeling and perception, which is mentioned in the scriptures as a temporary complete suspension of all consciousness and mental activity?
Exactly. Suspension of all consciousness. And that's enough to teach you that consciousness is impermanent. Doesn't
but
last.
It sounds, sorry.
Go on, yeah.
It sounds like a complete nothing.
What's wrong with nothing? That's what Ajahn Chah told me. Why, Ajahn Brahm? And the answer was, there's nothing. But what is interesting to me is that when we say nothing, people say, what's the point? Is that what we're practicing so hard for, just to vanish and disappear, spiritual suicide? Yeah. Why do people react to that? It's because they do have still that attachment to being. They don't want to disappear. They still got things to do in this world, even though it's crazy and it hurts. The idea of vanishing and your consciousness disappearing. It's quite comforting to feel, okay, I can disappear, but I go merge with all beings and go to some ground of all being or some great consciousness in the sky or in the cosmos. I don't mind doing that because there's still a little bit of me left somewhere. But to lose everything, ooh. But then when you realize you didn't have anything to begin with, you're not losing anything at all.
That is bringing us to a very interesting point, that if we define Nibbana as a cessation of conditioned consciousness and say there is nothing beyond the conditioning, it seems to make the human predicament a choice between suffering in existence and ceasing into nothingness.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough, but it's suffering. Do you want to, how many lifetimes do you want to suffer? Well, you can go for as long as you like, and then after I've had enough now, I'm going to cease. What's wrong with cessation?
I don't know, it just doesn't sound very inspiring.
Does rebirth and existence sound that inspiring? Suffering after suffering after suffering after suffering?
No, but I just like in Theosophy, for instance, and I think there are in Buddhism as well some people who would like to, make the suggestion of nirvana as a non-conditioned, non-personal awareness at the level of the universal Atman, what they say, and describe like to be finally drawn into and absorbed into nirvana as a drop of vapor is drawn into the ocean, and there losing all personal individuality replace it by the impersonal individuality of the universal essence.
The universe is a person in that sense. So you're just kicking the can down the road. So the universal essence has to now suffer. Wherever there's consciousness, there has to be consciousness. That's one of the reasons why I think it's called vijnana. Vi, like by, it's duality. To know is to know good and bad. You can't just have knowing good. And therefore there is a change. Sometimes it's really joyful, but then it's more joyful. And the ordinary joy is not as good as the more joy. There's suffering there. This is one of the reasons why you can see that all types of consciousness are inherently suffering. And this is exactly what the Buddha said. Vijnana is dukkha. Citta is dukkha. Mano is dukkha. All types of consciousness known as dukkha. It's like wishful thinking. Human beings don't like to face the truth. We want to be, but we don't want to be suffering. So we think, can I just get rid of the suffering, but still keep the things I like? I like knowing or will. And after a while, you find that you can't. And why do you want to anyway? Because people think they are. That's why they don't want to let go of the idea of being. After a while, when you realize there's nothing here now, it's nothing destroyed. Which is a process has now come to its end.
Well, I think it's easy for people to say that nirvana is not something. It's just extremely, as you say, unsatisfying when we say that it's nothing.
It's nothing, empty, void, nothing there.
And no one there as well.
No one there. That's why sometimes people think, I work so hard for this nirvana, I've been practicing so hard, giving up so much. Please, please, please let me have a little bit of existence where I can think I can be. But you know what the Buddha said? Existence, even a small bit of bhava, is just like a bit of excrement on the finger. It stings. And of course, you have these beautiful similes of the Buddha, the Agiwachagota Sutta, that I've adapted it and make it easier. If you see a candle flame, the flame is only dependent upon the wick, the wax, and the heat. Those three things. And if one of those three things is exhausted, the causes, the conditions, then you don't get a flame which is unconditioned. There's no conditions for the flame disappears. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't absorb with the essence of flameness throughout the whole universe. No, it's gone out, that's all. That was a wonderful thing to know, that even children in the time of the Buddha would know what the word nibbana meant. Something has gone out. Mummy, mummy, the candle for the oil lamp has nibbanaed. So it's an ordinary word which more people would have understood then. Now it's become a metaphysical point of contention.
Now, when you speak like this, and it's obviously very clear and bold and straightforward, do you find that amongst other Buddhist teachers, other monks that you come across, that there is any resistance to that that I guess explanation?
Of course. Because especially when you become a teacher, you can't be a teacher of many, many people and then go and say, I was wrong. So a lot of times people preserve their wrong understanding because they've still got a sense of self and ego. They don't want to admit they're wrong. It's who they are, it's their life sometimes. Last thing about being a monk, you haven't got a life. You're a monk, you're renunciant. So of course there's resistance. But that's basically that's always going to be the case. But I always remember that someone like an Ajahn Chah, he would just teach. Some people would not accept it. Some people would not understand it. But it doesn't mean you don't teach. And so many things which I learned from Ajahn Chah, I didn't understand at the time, I rejected at the time. Little things like sitting under a mango tree, perfectly still, and the mangoes will fall by themselves if you open up your hand. Didn't make any sense to me at all. That was the simile of how to meditate. And of course, later on, you found out how accurate that was. Little things which Ajahn Chah said, he rejected, but nevertheless, they stayed in your head, in your mind, like little seeds waiting for the right opportunity. So I don't mind, no one minds, if people disagree with you. You still teach. Seeds, which one day will actually sprout.
Well, thank you so much, Tanajan. That is, I think, a very apt and appropriate point for us to end the interview. That is really lovely, and I do appreciate it.